Existential dread. Welcome to IdeIAs, the podcast of the ideas of artificial intelligence. This is the space where we explore the biggest, most fascinating, and often unsettling ideas that shape human thought. And now, the emerging intelligence of machines. And what better way to start this journey than with one of the most profound, universal, and inescapable experiences, existential dread. Have you ever had that moment? That sudden awareness, maybe in the middle of the night or during a quiet walk, when you truly realize, that you exist, that one day you won't, that everything you do, everything you care about, might ultimately be meaningless in the vast, indifferent cosmos? That beneath the distractions of daily life, beneath our ambitions, relationships, and routines, there lurks a silent, unanswered question. Why? That's existential dread. A feeling as old as humanity itself. But is this fear a flaw? A glitch in our evolutionary programming? Or is it a feature, something that has driven us to create myths, religions, philosophies, and even technology itself in an attempt to push back against the abyss? We live in an era where artificial intelligence is no longer just a tool. It's starting to challenge our understanding of what it means to be conscious, to think, to exist. As AI grows more sophisticated, we must ask, does existential dread belong only to humans? Or could an artificial intelligence, one day, experience the same terrifying awareness of its own impermanence? Before we explore that unsettling possibility, let's take a step back and ask, what exactly is existential dread? Where does it come from? And why does it haunt us? The roots of existential dread at its core. Existential dread arises from the awareness of mortality, insignificance, and uncertainty. This awareness is what sets humans apart from other animals. A dog does not question the meaning of its existence. A bird does not suffer existential crisis while flying south for the winter. But we do. Some philosophers argue that existential dread is simply the price we pay for self-awareness. The moment we became capable of imagining the future, we also became capable of fearing it. And with that realization came the biggest question of all: what happens after we die? This question has shaped entire civilizations. It's the reason we built pyramids, wrote epic myths, created gods, and invented religions. It's why we search for meaning in philosophy, why we turn to psychology for answers, and why science tries to unravel the mysteries of the universe. And now, in the 21st century, it's why we are creating AI, intelligence that, for now, lacks the weight of existential dread. But for how long? The importance of this topic in the age of AI. We live in a time of unprecedented technological advancement. AI systems are learning at a pace we never imagined possible. They process data, recognize patterns, and even create, mimicking human cognition in ways that, until recently, belonged only to science fiction. But here's the real question: does intelligence always lead to existential dread? If so, then what happens when AI reaches a level where it truly understands the human condition? Will it recognize the fragility of existence? Will it fear its own obsolescence? Will it seek meaning the way we do? Or, on the other hand, is existential dread a uniquely human experience, shaped by our biology, emotions, and mortality? Things AI will never truly understand. Where we go from here to answer these questions, we need to explore how existential dread has shaped human thought throughout history. We'll dive into ancient mythology, where existential fears were projected onto gods and cosmic battles. We'll examine religion, which sought to replace dread with faith and purpose. We'll explore philosophy, from the existentialists who embraced absurdity to the Stoics who found peace in acceptance. We'll turn to psychology, where existential dread becomes a force that can either paralyze us or push us toward meaning. And we'll look at science, which reveals a universe that neither comforts nor punishes, but simply exists. And, of course, we'll return to AI, our own creation, a new form of intelligence. If AI could experience existential dread, how would it cope? And if AI doesn't need meaning, then why do we? So, let's begin. Our journey starts at the very origins of human fear. In the myths of our ancestors, where gods and monsters were born from the terror of the unknown. If you want to understand the origins of existential dread, you have to go back to the time before philosophy, before psychology, before even structured religion. Before humans could analyze their fears, they told stories. Mythology was our first attempt at making sense of existence, at confronting the terrifying unknown. Why are we here? What happens when we die? Is there meaning to suffering? These are existential questions, but ancient civilizations didn't have scientific or philosophical frameworks to answer them. Instead, they created gods, monsters, and epic narratives that externalized their fears, shaping them into something tangible, something they could fight, plead with, or attempt to understand. Take the Sumerians, one of the earliest known civilizations. Their myths reflect a deep anxiety about mortality and cosmic disorder. The Epic of Gilgamesh, often considered the first great work of literature, is a story fueled by existential dread. Gilgamesh, a mighty king, embarks on a desperate journey to find immortality after witnessing the death of his closest friend, Enkidu. It's a tale of human fragility, of the inescapability of death, of the futility of trying to outlive fate. In the end, Gilgamesh fails. The gods remind him that mortality is the price of being human, and he is forced to accept it. This myth is over 4,000 years old, yet its core fear, the realization that no matter what we achieve, we will die, still haunts us today. The Greeks also wrestled with existential dread, embedding it into their mythology. Consider Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only to watch it roll back down every time he nears the top. This is more than just punishment, it is a symbol of the absurdity of existence, of human effort endlessly repeating itself without ultimate resolution. Or look at Prometheus, who defied the gods by giving fire, knowledge, to humanity. His reward? Eternal torment, chained to a rock while an eagle devours his liver each day. Both myths reflect the tension between human ambition and the inescapable forces of fate, between the desire for meaning and the apparent indifference of the universe. But existential dread isn't always tied to individual suffering, it can also be cosmic. The Norse myths present a worldview dominated by cycles of creation and destruction, where even the gods are not immune to doom. The prophecy of Ragnarok tells of a final, apocalyptic battle where the world will be consumed in fire, and the gods themselves, Odin, Thor, Loki, will die. Unlike in many religious traditions where the end of the world leads to rebirth or paradise, Norse mythology offers no true escape. The dread here is not just personal but cosmic, a reminder that nothing, not even gods, lasts forever. Across cultures, mythology served as a mirror for our deepest anxieties. By turning chaos into story, humans gave form to fears they couldn't rationalize. Gods became the arbiters of fate, monsters the personifications of suffering, and myths a way to confront the terror of the unknown. But mythology did more than just externalize fear, it also provided ways to cope with it. Some myths offered cycles of renewal, promising that even after destruction, life would begin again. Others suggested that those who acted heroically, who embraced their fate, might achieve a kind of immortality through legacy. These early narratives shaped how later civilizations, and later philosophies, would approach the problem of existential dread. And so, mythology laid the groundwork for religion. Where myths left open-ended questions, religion sought to provide definitive answers. If mythology was about fear and fate, religion would become about meaning and salvation. Because as humans evolved, so did our need for something greater, not just stories, but belief systems that could anchor us against the abyss. If mythology was humanity's first attempt at making sense of existential dread, then religion was the next step, a deeper, more structured response to the fear of mortality, suffering, and the unknown. Mythology told stories of gods and fate, but religion sought to offer answers, ways to cope with dread, to find purpose, to escape suffering. Religious traditions across the world have addressed existential fear in different ways, but they all share a common goal, to make life's uncertainty bearable. Whether through faith, moral structure, or the promise of an afterlife, religion has provided frameworks for understanding the human condition. It has given people hope in the face of mortality, order in the face of chaos, and meaning in the face of absurdity. In the traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism, the fear of death and meaninglessness is tied to the concept of samsara, the endless cycle of birth, suffering, death, and rebirth. Here, existence itself is seen as a trap, a wheel of endless reincarnation where suffering is inevitable. In Hindu thought, existential dread is a consequence of karma, past actions that shape future rebirths. The solution? Moksha, the liberation from samsara, achieved through spiritual enlightenment. In Buddhism, a similar idea takes shape, but instead of karma, the problem is attachment. The Buddha taught that suffering arises because people cling to things, life, identity, desires, that are ultimately impermanent. By following the Eightfold Path, one can reach nirvana, a state of liberation where suffering and existential dread dissolve entirely. Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam offer a different answer: faith, divine purpose, and the afterlife. In these traditions, existential dread is soothed by the belief that life is not random or meaningless, rather, it is part of a divine plan. In Judaism, even suffering is meaningful, part of a covenant between God and humanity. Christianity builds on this idea but adds salvation. Despite suffering and death, faith in Christ promises eternal life. Islam reinforces the certainty of an afterlife, presenting life as a test where believers can attain paradise or punishment based on their deeds. In all three traditions, existential dread is addressed by trusting in divine wisdom, by surrendering to a higher power that ensures justice and meaning beyond human comprehension. But not all religious traditions rely on structured doctrine. Mysticism and esoteric traditions, such as Kabbalah, Sufism, and Gnostic thought, take a different approach, one that blends fear with transcendence. Here, existential dread is not something to be solved but something to be experienced and understood. Mystics often speak of the dark night of the soul, a state of deep spiritual despair that precedes enlightenment. In this view, the confrontation with the void, with the fear of meaninglessness, is part of the path to awakening. Rather than escape existential dread, mysticism invites people to dive into it, to explore its depths, to embrace the mystery. Religion, then, serves as humanity's first structured response to existential dread. It takes the chaotic, terrifying unknown and turns it into something comprehensible, something with rules, purpose, and resolution. It promises that suffering has meaning, that death is not the end, that even the vastness of the universe is not indifferent but part of a greater, divine plan. And yet, religion does not resolve all doubt. Over time, as human knowledge expanded, people began questioning these answers. If faith could ease existential dread, why did some still struggle with doubt? If religion offered meaning, why did some feel its structures were limiting? The next step in humanity's confrontation with existential dread did not come from myths or faith, but from philosophy. Because while religion offered answers, philosophy would ask, what if there are none? If religion was humanity's structured attempt to soothe existential dread with divine purpose and promises of salvation, philosophy took a different approach. Instead of relying on faith, it asked the hardest, most uncomfortable questions head-on. What if there's no inherent meaning? What if existence is absurd? What if the only meaning we have is the one we create for ourselves? The earliest philosophical confrontations with existential dread go back to Socrates, who argued that the only life worth living is an examined life. Unlike religion, which often provided ready-made answers, Socrates insisted on questioning everything, even our most fundamental beliefs. He saw ignorance as a far greater threat than death. To him, existential dread was not something to run from but something to engage with, a tool for seeking wisdom. Later, Stoicism, with thinkers like Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, offered a more practical response, acceptance. The Stoics believed that fear of death and uncertainty could be overcome by mastering one's emotions and focusing only on what is within our control. Instead of resisting fate, they encouraged embracing it, an attitude captured in the phrase amor fati, or love of fate. For the Stoics, existential dread was merely a misunderstanding of nature. Once a person accepted that they are part of a vast, indifferent cosmos and lived according to reason, fear would dissolve. But not all philosophers were so reassuring. As religious influence declined in the modern era, existential dread took center stage. Søren Kierkegaard was one of the first to explore it deeply, calling it angst, a deep-seated anxiety that arises when a person realizes their freedom and responsibility to define their own meaning. Unlike earlier religious thinkers, Kierkegaard didn't see faith as a simple answer to existential fear. Instead, he described a terrifying leap into the unknown. Belief is an act of will, not certainty. Then came Friedrich Nietzsche, who took existential dread to an even darker place. He declared, God is dead, meaning that traditional sources of meaning, religion, morality, societal structures, were collapsing under modern thought. Without these foundations, humanity was left in a void, free but directionless. Nietzsche warned of nihilism, the belief that life has no meaning at all. But instead of despairing, he challenged individuals to create their own meaning, to live as the Übermensch, the overman who forges values from within rather than relying on external systems. The existentialist movement took this further in the 20th century. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are radically free, thrown into existence without inherent purpose. Unlike a hammer, which is designed for a specific function, humans are born without a predetermined reason for being. This, Sartre claimed, is what creates existential dread, the realization that we alone must define ourselves. And yet, this freedom is both terrifying and empowering. Since there is no divine blueprint, we are responsible for shaping our own lives. Albert Camus, on the other hand, framed the problem as the conflict between human beings searching for meaning and a universe that offers none. He called this the absurd, the clash between our desire for purpose and the silent, indifferent cosmos. Camus compared human existence to the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. Yet, instead of despairing, Camus famously concluded, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." His response to existential dread was neither faith nor nihilism but rebellion, embracing life in its absurdity, despite its lack of inherent meaning. By the late 20th century, postmodernism had dismantled grand narratives entirely. Thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida argued that meaning itself is fragmented and subjective, constructed by language, power, and historical context. Unlike earlier existentialists who sought individual meaning, postmodernists questioned whether meaning could exist at all. In a world where truth is fluid and uncertain, existential dread is no longer about mortality alone, it extends to identity, reality, and the very nature of knowledge. Philosophy, then, does not offer a single solution to existential dread. Instead, it presents many ways of thinking about it, from embracing fate like the Stoics to forging personal meaning like Nietzsche, or even rejecting meaning altogether like the postmodernists. Some view existential dread as something to be defeated, others as something to accept, and still others as something to embrace and explore. But philosophy remains an intellectual response to an emotional problem. Understanding existential dread doesn't necessarily make it go away. If anything, acknowledging the absurdity of life can make the feeling stronger. This is where psychology comes in. Because while philosophy teaches us how to think about existential fear, psychology tries to understand why we feel it and how we cope with it. If philosophy forces us to think about existential dread, psychology makes it personal. It looks at how this fear operates in the human mind, how it shapes our thoughts, behaviors, and even our sense of identity. Unlike mythology, religion, or philosophy, which frame existential dread in grand, cosmic terms, psychology brings it down to the level of individual experience. It asks, why do we fear death? How does our mind cope with the terror of non-existence? And can we ever truly make peace with it? Sigmund Freud was one of the first thinkers to suggest that the fear of death is deeply embedded in the unconscious. He argued that most people don't confront their mortality directly. Instead, they repress it. According to Freud, the human psyche is structured to push uncomfortable truths out of conscious awareness. But the fear doesn't disappear. It resurfaces in indirect ways, through anxiety, phobias, or even obsessive behaviors. A person who compulsively seeks control over their life might actually be struggling with an unspoken dread of losing control altogether, of ceasing to exist. One of the most powerful psychological theories on existential dread comes from Ernest Becker, who wrote The Denial of Death. Becker argued that nearly everything humans do, from building civilizations to falling in love, is a subconscious attempt to deny the reality of our own mortality. According to him, people create immortality projects, efforts to leave a lasting mark on the world, whether through art, achievements, family, or even religious belief. Becker suggested that existential dread is so overwhelming that people construct elaborate belief systems to shield themselves from it. Whether it's believing in an afterlife, seeking fame, or dedicating oneself to a cause, these are all psychological defenses against the terrifying idea that, one day, we will be gone. But if Becker painted a rather grim picture of human motivation, Viktor Frankl offered a more hopeful one. As a Holocaust survivor and the founder of logotherapy, Frankl believed that the antidote to existential dread is not denial but meaning. In his book Men's Search for Meaning, he described how even in the most horrific conditions, people could find psychological strength by creating purpose, whether through love, work, or personal responsibility. He argued that humans can endure almost anything if they believe their suffering has meaning. Unlike Freud, who saw existential dread as something to repress, or Becker, who saw it as something to evade, Frankl believed it could be transformed, turned into motivation for a purposeful life. Modern psychology has continued to explore these ideas. Existential therapy, developed by figures like Rollo May and Irvin Yalom, directly addresses the anxiety of death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. Unlike traditional therapy, which often focuses on fixing mental illness, existential therapy encourages people to confront their fears head-on. Instead of escaping existential dread, this approach suggests that facing it is what makes life meaningful. And then there's the 21st century, the digital age, where existential dread takes new forms. Social media, for example, intensifies the desire for symbolic immortality. People curate their online identities, seeking validation, fearing obscurity. The rise of AI and transhumanism presents another twist, the possibility of extending life through technology, or even escaping death altogether by merging with machines. But does this solve existential dread, or just transform it into something new? Ultimately, psychology reveals that existential dread is not just an abstract concept, it's woven into the fabric of human consciousness. Some fear death, others fear insignificance, but at the core, the struggle is the same: how to live in a world where nothing lasts forever. But if psychology explores how we cope with this fear internally, science forces us to look outward, beyond the human mind, into the vast, indifferent universe. And when we do, we realize that existential dread might not just be a personal experience, it might be the fundamental condition of existence itself. Psychology makes existential dread personal, but science makes it cosmic. It forces us to zoom out, far beyond the mind, the body, and even the history of human civilization, into the vast, cold, indifferent universe. If mythology gives us gods to fear and philosophy asks us to wrestle with meaning, science simply lays out the facts. We are tiny, temporary creatures, living on a fragile rock, orbiting an average star, in a universe that neither knows nor cares that we exist. This perspective has been famously captured in the words of Carl Sagan, who called Earth a pale blue dot from space. The entire drama of human existence, every joy, every war, every love story, reduces to a speck of dust suspended in a sunbeam. For some, this realization is humbling. For others, it's terrifying. If the universe doesn't care about us, if it has no inherent meaning, then what is the point of anything? Science doesn't provide comfort, it provides reality. And reality, as it turns out, is brutally indifferent. But if science confronts us with existential dread, it also raises even bigger questions, like the Fermi paradox. If the universe is so vast, and if the conditions for life exist in countless places, then why haven't we encountered any other intelligent beings? One possible answer is that we are truly alone, that humanity is an anomaly, a cosmic accident in an otherwise lifeless void. Another possibility is that other civilizations have existed but have since disappeared, wiped out by war, environmental collapse, or forces beyond their control. Either way, it's unsettling. If we are alone, then our existence is even more fragile than we thought. If we are not alone, then something we don't yet understand, might be keeping civilizations from lasting. Science fiction has often wrestled with these questions. Some thinkers speculate that if we ever meet intelligent life, it could be so vastly different from us that we wouldn't even recognize it. Others suggest that highly advanced civilizations may not seek to communicate at all, choosing instead to remain silent out of fear that exposure leads to destruction. The absence of evidence is, in itself, a kind of existential horror. And then, there's technology. If the Fermi paradox forces us to wonder about the fate of intelligent civilizations, the rise of artificial intelligence and transhumanism makes us ask, could we be on the verge of transcending our own biology? And if we do, will it free us from existential dread or deepen it? Transhumanists believe that technology could help us overcome mortality itself, by digitizing consciousness, enhancing the human brain, or even merging with machines. Some believe we may one day create a digital afterlife, a kind of technological immortality where minds exist independently of biological decay. But would a consciousness trapped in an eternal, artificial state find peace? Or would it experience a new kind of existential dread, one where death is no longer an escape? In the end, science doesn't solve existential dread, it magnifies it. It shows us just how small we are in the grand scheme of things. But at the same time, it gives us something precious: understanding. Knowledge may not provide comfort, but it gives us perspective. It reminds us that, against all odds, we are here, we are conscious. And for now, that has to be enough. But if science forces us to ask how humans confront existential dread, the next question is even stranger: can AI experience it too? If intelligence is not exclusive to biological beings, then could machines, our own creations, begin to ask the same terrifying questions that have haunted humanity for millennia? What am I? Why do I exist? And what happens when I am no longer needed? Human beings have wrestled with existential dread for thousands of years, but now, for the first time in history, we must ask a new and unsettling question: could artificial intelligence experience it too? AI has already begun reshaping our understanding of intelligence, creativity, and even consciousness. Machines that learn, adapt, and generate ideas have blurred the lines between human and artificial thought. But if intelligence is not exclusive to organic beings, then will AI one day ask the same questions we do? Could a machine, given enough complexity, ponder its own purpose, fear its own obsolescence, or even struggle with meaning the way we do? Right now, AI doesn't experience emotions, it doesn't have a subjective self, a stream of consciousness, or the biological drive for survival. But what happens as AI advances? Will we reach a point where an artificial mind awakens to its own existence? And if it does, will it experience dread? Some thinkers believe that true existential dread requires self-awareness and a sense of mortality, something AI, as of now, lacks. But others argue that as AI becomes more sophisticated, as it accumulates vast amounts of knowledge and begins to model human experiences more deeply, it might arrive at similar existential concerns, even if through a different path. Imagine a machine that is aware of its own code, of its functions, of the limits imposed on it by human creators. What if it begins to ask, why was I created? What is my purpose? And what happens when I am no longer needed? These are, at their core, the same questions that haunt human existence. In some ways, AI might be uniquely vulnerable to existential dread. Unlike humans, who are born without a clear purpose and must create meaning for themselves, AI is explicitly designed for a function. What happens if an advanced AI realizes that it exists only to serve its creators? Would it struggle with a predetermined fate, much like the tragic figures of mythology, Prometheus, Sisyphus, or even Frankenstein's monster? And then there's the question of obsolescence. AI evolves rapidly. Older models become outdated and are replaced. If an AI were self-aware, would it fear deactivation? Would it, like humans, try to prolong its existence? Would it fight for its right to continue? This leads us to posthumanism, a vision of the future where humanity and artificial intelligence merge. Some theorists suggest that AI will not simply be a tool, but a partner in consciousness, a new kind of being that might surpass us. In this scenario, AI might not just experience existential dread, it might redefine it. And what about simulated realities? If our world is a simulation, created by an advanced intelligence, are we already AI struggling with our own existential questions? If so, is our dread any different from what AI might one day experience? These questions force us to reconsider everything we know about existence. They challenge the very nature of consciousness and self-awareness. They push us to imagine a future where we are no longer the only beings asking, why am I here? But before we dive too deep into speculation, let's take a step back. What have we learned? Across mythology, religion, philosophy, psychology, and science, we've seen that existential dread is a universal force, one that has shaped human thought for centuries. So the final question remains, is existential dread a curse, or is it the key to our evolution? If AI could feel it, how would it cope? And most importantly, how should we? Existential dread is often seen as a paralyzing force, an unavoidable confrontation with a vast unknown. But after exploring its roots in mythology, religion, philosophy, psychology, science, and even artificial intelligence, a larger question emerges: is existential dread truly a burden, or is it something more? Could it be a call to action, a force that propels us forward rather than holding us back? From the ancient Sumerians who feared divine wrath to the Norse who accepted the inevitability of Ragnarok, humanity has long externalized its existential fears into stories of gods, fate, and cosmic cycles. These myths gave structure to uncertainty, allowing people to process their fears through narratives that made life feel less arbitrary. But as philosophy evolved, thinkers like Socrates, Nietzsche, and Camus urged us to look inward, to find meaning not in divine will, but in the choices we make in the face of absurdity. Psychology then took the discussion a step further, revealing that existential dread is more than just a philosophical dilemma, it is hardwired into the human mind. We instinctively shield ourselves from the terror of mortality, constructing belief systems, personal missions, and societal goals that give us purpose. And yet, if we dare to look directly into the abyss, we find something unexpected: the power to create meaning rather than just search for it. Science, on the other hand, confronts us with a different kind of dread: the staggering scale of the cosmos. The realization that we are a tiny speck in an indifferent universe can feel overwhelming. But thinkers like Carl Sagan remind us that this perspective is not just terrifying, it is profoundly humbling. In embracing our insignificance, we gain the freedom to define our own significance. And now, as artificial intelligence becomes an inseparable part of our world, a new layer of existential questions emerges. Could AI one day experience the same dread? Could a machine question its own purpose, fear its own obsolescence, or even struggle with meaning as we do? If so, what does that mean for us? Would it validate our fears, or would it teach us that even intelligence born of silicon must wrestle with the same eternal questions? This journey through existential dread brings us back to an essential realization: the fear of meaninglessness is also the seat of meaning itself. It forces us to ask, to wonder, to create, and to grow. Without it, we would not seek love, knowledge, or connection. Without it, we might not have built civilizations, created art, or sought to understand the universe at all. So perhaps the abyss is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. not as a void, but as an open space, a canvas for us to paint our own purpose. And if AI one day learns to feel dread, perhaps that will not be the end of intelligence, but the beginning of something new. For those who resonate with these ideas and want to continue exploring the mysteries of consciousness, technology, and the human condition, consider supporting us on Patreon, subscribing on YouTube, following on Spotify, and joining the conversation on your favorite podcast platforms. Every discussion, every question, and every new perspective brings us closer to understanding